Hey folks, this chapter that we're dealing with deals with the self, perception, and communication. So you'll learn things about yourself, that you have a self concept, that you have levels of self awareness and levels of self esteem. We're also going to talk about the perception process and how this affects our communication with other people. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to talk about is the self concept. Now, our textbook defines the self concept as a relatively stable set of perceptions each person holds of himself or herself. An even simpler definition would just basically be the image you have of yourself. So, this idea you have about yourself. It'll include things like your physical characteristics. Are you a short, sweet girl? Are you a tall, rugged man? What kind of social traits do you have? Are you patient? Are you kind? Are you generous? It also includes our social roles. Like a part of my self-concept would be that I'm a community college communications instructor. So that's one of my social roles. If you're a mother, you might define yourself as being a mother. If you are, a triplet, you might define yourself as being one of three, triplets. You also include things like your defining interest, any talents you have. Like, for example, if you're a wonderful dancer, you might include that in your self-concept, and the beliefs that you have. So that's what this is. This is this idea we have about ourselves. Not everybody's self-concept is 100% accurate. Like, you might see someone on TV who really thinks they're funny. You don't see it, but they think they're funny, or something like that. But that's your self-concept. Now we're going to talk about some things that influence our self-concept. How do you get that image about yourself? The first example is self-esteem. Self-esteem influences your self-concept. Okay? Basically, what self-esteem is how valuable you feel to yourself. Okay? Our textbook says that self-esteem involves an evaluation of our self-worth. But it just means how good or how valuable do you feel you are? Now, here's the thing. People with higher self-esteem are more typically willing to communicate. So if you see somebody who's really shy and doesn't open up easily, their self-esteem might be a little lower than somebody who's more outgoing and open to communication. The next thing that influences our self-concept is significant others. And what we mean by significant others are those people that are closest to us, that are most significant to us, but not just your romantic partners. This is technically called reflective appraisal, or other terms would call it the looking glass self, that you see yourself in the communication of other people. Okay? So if people always say to you, like, oh, you're the sweetest, kindest person, and these people are important to you, you're going to start to internalize that. Now, the one interesting thing is this becomes less powerful as you age. And the last thing that we're going to talk about influencing our self-concept is culture. Now, the one thing I pulled out of the textbook is that most non-Western cultures are collectivistic. Collectivistic cultures look at the good of all rather than the individualistic tendencies we have. Our culture tends to be individualistic. We worry more about how things affect us and not culture as a whole. But non-Western cultures tend to be more collectivistic. So they gain identity from being members of certain groups. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what our self-concept itself influences. The first thing it does is it influences our communication with other people. So, for example, your self-concept both shapes and is shaped by much of your communication behavior. One example I pulled from the textbook was teasing. Children with a lower opinion of themselves are more likely to see themselves as victims of bullying, where people with higher self-esteem will see themselves as being joked with or joshed with. The next thing that is influenced by our self-concept is the future communication and behavior. There's something called the self-fulfilling prophecy, and this is really interesting. What happens is we make a prediction or an expectation of something, and then we act in a way that makes the outcome more likely to occur. This happened to me once. I had some friends when I was in college and everyone was dating and I was single, and they're like, oh, we're going to this party, why don't you come? And I didn't feel like going alone, and they're like, oh, you'll meet someone at this party. And I remember saying to them, I don't meet people at parties. So I went to the party with them. I didn't really have a great time. I probably kept to myself a little bit. I was shy in college. And then when I left, I was like, yeah, I told you I wouldn't meet anyone, but I didn't take into account the fact that I didn't really act as if I wanted to meet someone. I kind of kept to myself. I wasn't overly talkative. So that's an example of the self-fulfilling prophecy. You make a prediction because of an expectation of an event, and because you act a certain way, it makes the outcome more likely to occur. Okay? Now, here's a quick slide about perceiving others effectively. Now, this is going to sound a little shocking to some people, but no one, according to our textbook, is entirely male or female. We use the influences of testosterone and estrogen, but they're not all encompassing. Okay, we have to remember that sex is a biological category where gender is more of a social construct. And you might be noticing that in our culture there's more and more genders becoming available. And one last word I want you to be familiar with is the term androgynous. Androgynous people combine the characteristics, not necessarily physical characteristics, but characteristics of males and females. The next thing we're going to talk about is attribution. Attribution is the process of attaching meaning to behavior, but in simpler words, it just means explaining why someone acted the way they did. The first thing we have to realize is we tend to judge ourselves better than we judge others. So, for example, this is called the self-serving bias. This is when you might say something like, I put on the PowerPoint, I aced that test because I'm a great student. But if you didn't do well on the test, you're more likely to put the emphasis off yourself and onto someone else and say something like, I failed the test because the instructor doesn't know how to teach. The self-serving bias is this tendency we have to explain things that cast us in the most favorable light. So we're going to try and make ourselves look good, but we don't worry about doing that to other people. That's a bias. So that's why this is called the self-serving bias. We serve ourselves better than others. We also, when we're attributing to people's behavior, trying to figure out why they're doing what they're doing, we tend to assume others are similar to us. They may have different characteristics and different traits and react to things differently. So that's another way we're kind of biased here, is that we tend to assume that just because someone else is acting, they should act like us. And finally, the fundamental attribution error of perception is the tendency we have to put the focus on people for things we attribute negatively instead of on external factors. So, for example, let's say you're planning a surprise party and you tell everyone to be there by 7, but one person comes late and ruins it. You're more likely to say, well, he or she just doesn't care about being on time or something, or putting the focus on them and not on the fact that maybe there was road construction or their car broke down or they got lost or something. So these are just some things to remember when you're trying to perceive others effectively. Now, the next section talks about empathy and perception challenges. Empathy is the ability to project oneself onto another person's point of view, to experience their thoughts and feelings. It's not the same as sympathy. We've all heard of sympathy. Sympathy is just showing compassion to another situation. Empathy is the ability to actually feel the world in their shoes. So we're going to talk about perception checking. It's a 3-part process of verifying the accuracy of your interpretations. So remember, number 1, you want to include a description of the sense data, what your senses are picking up. Number 2, you want to put in 2 possible interpretations, and finally a request for confirmation of the interpretation. Here's my example. Hey, you slammed the door. That was the sense data. That was what my senses picked up. I wasn't sure if you were mad at me, which was my first impression, or if you were just in a rush, you're my second interpretation. Are we good, or do we need to talk? See how this simple sentence helps you check a perception. So you may perceive someone as being in a really bad mood, but you can go back and ask them this, and by asking this, by giving both your first impression and a second interpretation, describe the behavior, and then request, confirmation on what you're asking. Now we're going to talk a little bit about identity management. This is how we try and have others see us. Okay? These are technically strategies used by communicators to influence how we view them. So your perceived self is that reflection of your self-concept. That's how you perceive yourself. But your presenting self is the image you try to present to others. Okay? So maybe you're not always the most patient person. But when you're dealing with friends, you work harder at trying to show that you're patient to present that to another person. We also have our face, which is the socially approved identity that a communicator tries to present. So we put this face up and we use face work, which is verbal and nonverbal behaviors designed to create and maintain your face, or create that approved identity that you're created in the face of other people. Remember, you have a lot of different identities. Okay, so you might have your church member identity and your student identity and your employee identity, and maybe if you're a parent, your parental identity. All these are different identities that you tend to manage. We tend to manage these identities by involving other people. We're collaborative. We like to talk about these things. You may be doing it consciously or unconsciously. People often differ in their degree of identity management, where some people worry very much about their identity management and other people don't worry about it, maybe not even enough. This also includes your social media. People manage your identities online by sharing certain activities or certain posts and things like that. And just because you manage your identity doesn't mean you're dishonest. It just means you're trying to put yourself forward in the best light.